Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Computers Client Build 6, Part 6. In the last video I did a lot of work on the mods and brought the system close to completion. This video is going to be focused on finishing the build. This is the final part of the build log. I need to do a little bit more work on the wiring and a couple of other things. I also need to cover the test results and give you a good look around the finished product. Now, I mentioned in the last video that I'm not showing the process of the wiring in this build log, and almost every comment on the last video was in protest to that. Because of the amount of enthusiasm for it, coming up I'm planning on doing some wiring guides, and in future build logs I will give more detail on the process of the wiring. Okay, here I have the last of the wiring. Actually, all except one cable. I couldn't do the final 6-pin PCIe cable because I ran out of pins. But the good thing is, in the meantime, while I'm waiting for the pins to arrive, I can use the onboard graphics to install Windows and get everything configured and ready to go. Now, the reason I'm not showing the process of the wiring now is because I've already done most of the wiring for this build, and I'm just going to leave it for future videos. Anyway, let's take a closer look at this wiring. Okay, the 6-pin PCIe. Now, this is actually one of the wires I've made up from scratch. And what I mean by that, it wasn't an existing cable that I've modified. I've built it from the ground up. So I've cut lengths of wire, actually 18 gauge wire for this one, stripped the ends, put new pins on it, then sleeved it and put the connectors on. And it's just a very simple wire because this part of the power supply is modular. It takes a male 6-pin PCIe, which is the same as what I need on the other end to plug into the graphics card. You can see it matches up nicely with the rest of the wiring in the build. I have the blue on the outside and white in the middle. So the SATA power, you can see I have two of them, and I talked about this in the last video. Instead of running out one modular cable and doing all of the components, I decided to run out one modular cable per component. It's a lot cleaner this way and easier to manage the cables. So on one end I have a right angled SATA connector, and on the other end I have the modular connector that plugs into the power supply. And I've actually taken that from the power supply cables. The rest of these cables I've made up from scratch. One is slightly longer than the other just because of the placement of the hard drive and SSD in the build. The SATA data cables, I was going to do these in either white or blue. I chose white just to create a bit of a better color balance inside of the case. I've installed the cables and I just successfully booted the system for the first time, so it's up and running at last. There's still a few things I need to do. I need to make up the final 6-pin PCIe power cable and also wire up the power button. As well as that, I need to do a bit of cable management. That's one of the great things about custom wiring. There's really not much cable management to do because there's nothing to hide. I am going to add a few cable ties here and there though, just to hold things into position. I'm also going to remove both of the stickers from the power supply because, as you can see, the one on this side is upside down. And I've actually decided to install a backplate on the graphics card. I did actually order one for this graphics card, but I decided not to install it because the color of the PCB is so close to the color of the paint job, the coolant and the sleeving. But at this point I think it will be a nice addition. It's going to clean things up a little bit. It's a black backplate, so it's going to match up nicely. Anyway, I'm going to move on with all of that now. I've finished everything I just mentioned and the build is now complete. So as you can see, I've removed the stickers from the power supply. And I think it looks a lot cleaner. It's definitely an improvement. I've also installed the backplate on the graphics card and it matches up nicely with the EK Supremacy and the other black components in the build. It definitely looks better than the bare PCB. I know some people aren't going to like the CSQ design, but I think it's harder to see on a black surface. I've also done the cable management. There was hardly any to do. I just had to add 3 cable ties and they weren't actually really necessary. I just did it to bundle the wiring together a bit more tightly. That's about it on this side. Now for a look around the other side of the build. So you can see the finished 6-pin PCIe power cables and also the wiring for the power button, which is actually not quite finished. I've done about half of it. I've had to make up a couple of wires for it. I'll talk more about that shortly. Now, the cable routing for the 6-pin PCIe, I had a few ways to go with it, but this was the only way where the wiring wasn't kinked, where I didn't have to add unnecessary cable length, and where the cables were completely in sight. I could have gone out and around in a big curve off the end of the graphics card, but you know, I would have needed a couple of inches of extra cable length for that. I could have gone behind the graphics card, the cables would then have been out of sight, and I also could have kinked the cables straight up and over and gone straight down in front of the graphics card, but then, you know, the side panel is really close to the graphics card, so it would have been a bad kink in the cables. But anyway, the wiring for the power button, I've made up two separate wires because the front panel connectors on the motherboard are actually inaccessible. They're they're underneath the graphics card. So when removing the side panel, it would be too difficult to disconnect the wiring from the motherboard and then reconnect it every time. So with the motherboard was included a wire actually specifically for this purpose. And basically all I've done is removed some of the other wires that I didn't need. For example, the hard drive LED and reset button, because all I have is a power button. I've also sleeved it and swapped some of the connectors around, but this plugs directly into the motherboard. It will stay there permanently. It goes between the motherboard and the wiring for the power button. So it's just going to make it a lot easier to disconnect the power button when removing the side panel. I've now finished the rest of the wiring for the power button, and I'm actually just about to put the side panels on and start the testing. You can see I put heat shrink up and over the back of the power button to clean things up. This wire plugs into the other wire that stays permanently plugged into the motherboard, and as you can see, this makes things really easy when installing and removing the side panel. Now that bleed through you can see there, I actually go back and re-sleeve that wire. But anyway, now it's time for me to get the side panels on and give you a look at the finished product. So here it is. This build has been a massive amount of work. I'm now just going to do a little bit of a summary and answer a few questions. I've had a lot of people concerned about the paint job, that it's going to crack because of how flexible the panels are. This paint is specifically designed to be used on flexible plastic panels, and I used a primer specifically designed for it. I did a lot of surface prep, everything that was necessary. My first choice was a vinyl dye for this build, and a vinyl dye would have been a lot easier, but I wanted this specific finish. You can see how glossy it is. This is what I was going for. Also, the color match between the coolant, the paint, and the sleeving, you know, wouldn't really have been possible with a vinyl dye. So I'm definitely glad I went with the paint. Now, the front panel mod, I had so many people question me about the white radiator grille. You know, people said it should have been black or blue instead. At last you can see that I went with the white radiator grille to match up with the side panels. Now this was another comment that came up a lot on the last video. A lot of people didn't like how I routed the 24-pin motherboard cable up and over one of the tubes. Now I had to route it that way. There was no other way to route it. I couldn't go under that tube. There was no way I could kink the cables around that tightly, just because of the angle that the 24-pin motherboard power is on. I mean, you have to remember how small this case is and how tight it is in there. You really do have limited options with tubing routing and cable routing. Anyway, now moving on to the test results, and I'm going to start with the temperature results. From now on, for all of my temperature testing, I'm going to mathematically reduce my ambient temperature to 20 degrees Celsius just to save confusion. I have high ambient temperatures where I live, and this pushes up my temperature results. A lot of people don't know why they're so high. So for all of this testing, my ambient temperature was 20 degrees Celsius. Also, the side panels were on, the fans were running at 100%, the pump was running PWM controlled on the silent profile. You can set that up in the BIOS. Basically, it was running between 20 and 50% of its actual RPM, so very silent. So first of all, at stock clocks, for the idle test, I cold boot the system, let the system idle for 30 minutes. The CPU was 22 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees above ambient. The GPU 21 degrees Celsius, 1 degree above ambient. For the load test, I run Prime 95 small FFT for 30 minutes, CPU 42 degrees Celsius, GPU 42 degrees Celsius. For the overclock, I took the CPU to 4.5 GHz, 1.25 volts, memory to 1600 MHz, 99924, 1.5 volts, which is its XMP profile. And the graphics card, I just gave a small overclock, 100 MHz on the core and 100 MHz on the memory. So for the idle test, the CPU was 30 degrees Celsius, GPU 24 degrees Celsius. At load, the CPU 66 degrees Celsius, GPU 36 degrees Celsius. Now moving on to the noise output results. I'm not going to use my decibel meter for this because it's not going to pick up a result. All of the components in this build put out less than 20 decibels. As I mentioned, the fans I have running at 100%. The pump I have running PWM controlled. It reaches about a maximum of 70 to 80% when the CPU reaches high temperatures, but most of the time it's sitting at around 30 to 50%. I'm now just going to give you a quick listen to the build. So that should give you a rough idea of the noise output. Now for the performance results, which I'm going to show you in screenshots. I'm going to show you the stock clock results and the overclock results so that you can compare them. So that brings this build log to a close. It's certainly been a lot of work building this system, but it's been a lot of fun and I'm really happy with it. I'm going to finish things up with some photos. There's plenty more client builds to come. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and favorite if you want to see more.